Hello and welcome back to Basement Philosophy, or Philosophy from the Depths. This week we'll look through some of the readings for the topic of the place of philosophy in religion. And we'll start with a book by Averroes called On the Harmony of Religion and Philosophy. And this is the book we looked at in the first segment, where Averroes argues that Muslims have a duty to philosophize. It's a short book, 3 chapters, 27 pages in all. I definitely recommend reading the first chapter and the second one as well if you've got the time. If you don't have the time to read the whole of the chapter 2, then just the first few pages of it will be fine. Next is an English translation of Zara Jacobs' treatise. It's from a website, and so each chapter has its own page on the website, so you're going to have to click the link at the bottom of each page in order to move on to the next chapter. There are actually 15 chapters in all, or 16 if you include a concluding chapter that was written by Walter Hayward, which was Zara Jacobs' student. Unfortunately, the website only includes the first 11 chapters, but this does cover all of the philosophical material at least. And the author of the website also adds some comments at the bottom of each chapter, and these can help clarify what Jacob is saying or put his words into context. So it's worth taking a look at these comments as well. Next is an article on the significance of Zara Jacobs' philosophy. And this is a useful article, and you may find it worthwhile reading it alongside or perhaps even before reading Jacobs' treatise. The author of the article is Claude Sumner, and he's an expert on Ethiopian philosophy. And here he gives a very reliable account of Jacobs' philosophy. Next, we have a podcast from the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps series. And this one is called In You I Take Shelter, Zara Jacob. It's a helpful introduction to the context and content of Zara Jacobs' philosophy. And this podcast also raises the question of the authenticity of Jacob's text. But you'll need to listen to a different podcast on Walter Hayward to get more information about that. Now, there isn't much literature on Zara Jacob out there, and this book by Kairos is one of the longest pieces available at present. Unfortunately, it's got many flaws, shall we say. And I would recommend approaching it with a critical attitude. In other words, don't just accept that everything in it is right. Judge for yourself what's worthwhile and what's not. The most useful chapter is chapter 3, which contains an outline of Jacob's thought. Although I would recommend reading this, I would suggest doing so after having read Jacob's treatise, because then it will be easier to assess what Kairos is saying in this book. And then we have a book, Medieval Islamic Philosophical Writings. And this book contains 5 different writings by Islamic philosophers, including the version of Hai bin Yaksan that I used in the lecture. Now, this is a short text. It's about 50 pages or so it can be read in 1 or 2 sittings. Unfortunately, the editor of this book left out the very first and very last parts of the story. So if you want to read the whole story without any parts left out at all, then you'll have to go to another edition of the book that the library has 4 copies of. And this book was edited by Len E. Goodman. And for more information on the story of Hai bin Yaksan, there's also this useful little podcast, again, in the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps series. And this one is called Fantasy Island. And curiously, the story of Hai bin Yaksan has also been made into an animated movie, which for some reason seems to be available only on YouTube. It's beautifully made, it's very engaging, but it isn't completely faithful to the book. It adds some things to the story, and it leaves some things out. Most notably, almost none of the philosophy in the book makes it into the film. So The film is not a substitute for reading the book, I'm afraid. But it is still worth a watch because it's a beautiful animation. So if you've got a spare 1 hour and 20 minutes, then you could do worse than watch this. Next is Philosophy in Andalusia, and that's chapter 8 of the Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy. This chapter looks at 2 Islamic philosophers, one of which is Ibn Tufayl, but you'll need to zip forward to page 165 to get to him. And this is worth reading, this chapter, because it offers some background and context for the ideas in Hayy bin Yaqzan. And it's probably best reading this after you've read Hayy bin Yaqzan, as it'll help you to understand some of the things that otherwise might seem a little puzzling. And our last item this week is a book about Ibn Tufayl's influence on European thought. And with this book, I'd recommend reading chapter 3. This chapter provides a nice, clear synopsis of the story of Hayy bin Yaqzan and some helpful analysis as well. And you'll also discover just how influential this book has been in Europe. Well, okay, that's it for the week. So I'll see you again next week for more Basement Philosophy.